They say the Deadlands don't give second chances. The sun burns mercy out of the sand by noon, and by nightfall the cold seeps into your bones like a thief stealing what little warmth you have left. Most people who enter that cursed stretch of desert either know the way through or never make it out. But Sarah Colton wasn't most people. She was a woman who had trusted the wrong man, believed in the wrong promise, and paid for it with blood, sweat, and a crawl across 70 miles of hell itself. This is not a story about rescue. This is a story about what happens when the person who swore to protect you leaves you to die, and you decide that dying isn't good enough. This is about the moment when survival becomes defiance, when every inch forward is a refusal to let the desert, the betrayal, or the darkness win. Sarah Colton didn't wait for someone to save her. She saved herself, one agonizing movement at a time, until a stranger on horseback found what the vultures hadn't claimed. But before that stranger appeared on the horizon, before the trail rider named James Mackenzie saw the impossible sight of a woman still breathing where nothing should live, there was the abandonment. There was the Marshal. And there was the beginning of a journey that would break Sarah Colton down to nothing so she could build herself back up into something the desert couldn't kill. Sarah Colton had never imagined her life would lead her to the middle of the Deadlands with a man she barely knew. But circumstances had a way of pushing people into corners they never expected. 3 months ago, she had been living in the mining town of Copper Ridge, working at the general store and saving every penny she could. Her plan was simple: earn enough to buy a small piece of land somewhere green, somewhere far from the dust and the drunken miners who made her walk home feel like a gauntlet every night. She wanted peace. She wanted safety. She wanted a life that didn't require her to keep a knife in her boot. Then Marshal William Garrett rode into town. He was tall, clean-shaven, and carried himself with a kind of authority that made people step aside when he walked down the street. He wore a badge that caught the sunlight, and when he smiled at Sarah through the store window, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. He was kind to her. He bought supplies and stayed to talk. He asked her about her life, her dreams, and he listened like her words mattered. Within 2 weeks, he had asked her to travel with him to Silver Falls, a town 3 days' ride away where he claimed to have property and a future waiting. He painted pictures with his words, describing a house with a porch, a garden, and a life where Sarah wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. She said yes. How could she not? Marshal Garrett represented everything she wanted: protection, stability, and the promise of something better. She packed her few belongings into a warm leather bag, said goodbye to the store owner who had given her work, and climbed onto the back of the Marshal's horse. They rode out of Copper Ridge on a clear morning, and Sarah felt like she was riding toward a new beginning. The first day of travel was pleasant. Marshal Garrett was charming and attentive. He pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the outlaws he had captured and the justice he had served. Sarah listened and allowed herself to believe that her luck had finally changed. They camped that night under a sky full of stars, and the Marshal built a fire while Sarah prepared a simple meal from the supplies they carried. He was polite, respectful, and Sarah began to relax. Maybe this was real. Maybe this man was exactly who he appeared to be. The second day started to show cracks in the facade. Marshal Garrett became quieter, more withdrawn. When Sarah asked him questions, his answers were short and clipped. He rode faster, pushing the horse harder, and Sarah had to grip his waist tightly to keep from being thrown off. She told herself he was just tired, that the long ride was wearing on him. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that made her uneasy. It was a coldness she hadn't seen before, a distance that hadn't been there in Copper Ridge. By the third day, they had veered off the main trail. Sarah noticed but didn't say anything at first. She assumed the Marshal knew a shortcut or was avoiding a dangerous area. But as the hours passed and the landscape became more barren, more hostile, she began to feel a creeping sense of dread. The greenery disappeared, the trees thinned, and then vanished altogether. The ground turned to sand and rock, and the heat became oppressive. This was the Deadlands, a place people avoided unless they had no other choice. Sarah had heard stories about this desert. People went in and didn't come out. Water was scarce, shade was non-existent, and the sun could kill you just as easily as a rattlesnake. She finally spoke up. "Marshal, where are we? This doesn't look like the way to Silver Falls." Her voice was steady, but inside, her heart was pounding. He didn't look back at her. "Change of plans?" he said simply. "What do you mean, change of plans? You said Silver Falls was 3 days." "We've been riding 3 days." But this isn't a town. This is the middle of nowhere. He pulled the horse to a stop. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah could hear her own breathing, could feel the sweat trickling down her back. The marshal dismounted and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. "Get down," he said. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to stay on the horse, to demand answers. But she also knew that defying him could make things worse. She slid off the horse, her boots hitting the hard ground with a thud. She stood there, waiting, her hand instinctively moving toward the knife in her boot. Marshal Garrett reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. He took a long drink, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at Sarah with those cold eyes and said, "You are never going to Silver Falls, Sarah. There is no house. There is no property. There's just this." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "You said." "I know what I said. I needed you to trust me, and you did." "That's the problem with people like you, Sarah. You're too willing to believe in something better. Too willing to trust a man with a badge." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. "Why? Why would you do this?" He shrugged. "Money. There's a man in Copper Ridge who paid me good coin to make sure you disappeared. Seems you saw something you shouldn't have. Or maybe you're just in someone's way." "I didn't ask for details. I just took the job." The betrayal was like a knife twisting in her chest. "You're not even a real marshal, are you?" He smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Sarah had ever seen. "The badge is real. I took it off a dead man in Texas. It opens doors, makes people trust you. You'd be surprised how easy it is to fool people when you look the part." Sarah's mind raced. She had to think, had to find a way out of this. "You can't just leave me here. I'll die." "That's the idea," he said flatly. He walked back to his horse and began to mount. "There's no water for miles, no shade, no trail. Even if you start walking, you'll be dead before sundown. The desert will take care of you, and no one will ever know what happened." "Please," Sarah said, hating the desperation in her voice. "Please don't do this." He just spurred the horse and rode off, leaving Sarah standing alone in the vast emptiness of the Deadlands. She watched him disappear into the shimmering heat, her legs trembling, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The man she had trusted, the man she had believed would give her a better life, had just condemned her to death. For a long moment, Sarah just stood there. The shock was overwhelming. She wanted to scream, to cry, to collapse onto the sand and give up. But something inside her, something stubborn and furious, refused to let her fall. She had survived too much to die like this. She had endured her father's fists, her mother's abandonment, the grinding poverty of Copper Ridge. She had clawed her way through a life that had tried to break her at every turn. She wasn't going to let a fake marshal and a patch of desert finish the job. Sarah looked around, trying to assess her situation. She had the clothes on her back, the knife in her boot, and nothing else. No water, no food, no supplies. The sun was already high in the sky, beating down on her with relentless intensity. She had no idea which direction led to safety. The Deadlands stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of sand and rock. She made a decision. She would walk. She didn't know where she was going, but staying still was death. Movement, even aimless movement, gave her a chance. She picked a direction that felt right, or maybe just felt less wrong, and started walking. The first few hours were manageable. Sarah's legs were strong from years of standing behind the store counter, and she set a steady pace. But as the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. It wasn't just hot, it was suffocating, like walking into an oven. Her skin burned. Her throat became dry and scratchy. She tried not to think about water, but the more she tried, the more her mind fixated on it. She imagined cool streams, the well behind the general store, the rain that sometimes fell on Copper Ridge in the spring. By midday, Sarah's strength began to fail. Her steps became slower, more labored. Her vision blurred at the edges. She knew she was in trouble, but she kept moving. Stopping meant dying, and she wasn't ready to die. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to stumble. Her feet caught on rocks she didn't see. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. She fell once, scraping her hands on the rough ground, and it took everything she had to push herself back up. The sun was merciless. It drained her, hollowed her out, until she felt like a husk being blown across the sand. When the sun finally began to set, Sarah collapsed. She couldn't go any further. Her body simply gave out. She lay on the ground, staring up at the sky as it turned from blue to orange to purple. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the cold that had seemed impossible just hours ago now seeped into her bones. She shivered violently, her body trying to generate warmth it didn't have. Sarah knew she was dying. She could feel it, but she also knew she had made it through one day. That was something. That was more than the Marshal had expected. As darkness swallowed the Deadlands, Sarah closed her eyes and let herself drift into unconsciousness. If she woke up, she would keep moving. If she didn't, at least she had tried. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the sky was still dark, but there was a faint glow on the horizon. Dawn was coming. She was still alive. Her body screamed in protest as she tried to move. Every muscle ached. Her skin felt like it was on fire. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. But she was alive. She forced herself to sit up. The world spun, and she had to close her eyes until it steadied. When she opened them again, she looked out at the Deadlands stretching endlessly before her. She had no idea how far she had come, or how far she still had to go. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to stop. Sarah began to crawl. Walking was no longer possible. Her legs wouldn't hold her, but she could move on her hands and knees, dragging herself forward inch by painful inch. It was slow, agonizing work, but it was movement. It was survival. The second day was worse than the first. The sun returned with a vengeance, and Sarah had no strength left to fight it. She crawled through the morning, through the afternoon, through the endless hours of heat and pain. Her hands bled from the rough ground. Her knees were raw and torn. She didn't think about the Marshal anymore. She didn't think about Copper Ridge or Silver Falls or the life she had wanted. She only thought about the next foot, the next yard, the next moment. By the third day, Sarah was no longer fully conscious. She moved in a haze, her body operating on instinct alone. She didn't know where she was or where she was going. She just moved. Forward! Always forward! The desert tried to claim her, but she refused to let it. Every crawl was an act of defiance. Every breath was a refusal to surrender. And then, on the afternoon of the fourth day, she heard it. The sound of hooves. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. The mind played tricks in the desert. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. Sarah lifted her head, her vision blurred and unfocused. She saw a shape in the distance, a man on a horse. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone. She tried to wave, but her arm wouldn't lift. All she could do was lie there, barely breathing, barely alive, and hope that whoever it was would see her. The rider came closer. He was a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He dismounted and ran to her side, kneeling in the sand. "Good God," he whispered. "You're alive." Sarah's eyes met his, and in that moment she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was going to survive this after all. James Mackenzie had been riding the trails for 15 years, moving cattle, delivering messages, and occasionally guiding travelers through dangerous territory. He knew the land better than most men knew their own faces. He could read the sky, predict storms, and find water where others saw only dust. But in all his years crossing the Deadlands, he had never seen anything like what he saw that afternoon. A woman lying in the sand, more dead than alive, her body broken and sunburned, but somehow still breathing. He had almost missed her. The sun was in his eyes, and the glare off the sand made everything shimmer and distort. He had been taking a shortcut to reach the town of Red Creek before nightfall, when his horse suddenly stopped and refused to go forward. James trusted his horse's instincts more than his own sometimes, so he dismounted to investigate. That's when he saw her, a crumpled figure barely distinguishable from the sand around her. James ran to her side and dropped to his knees. Her skin was blistered and peeling, her lips cracked and bleeding, her clothes torn and filthy. Her eyes were half closed, but when he leaned over her, they flickered open just enough to register his presence. She was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Her throat was too dry, her body too depleted. "Easy now," James said softly, reaching for the canteen on his belt. "I've got you. You're going to be all right." He wasn't sure if that was true, but he said it anyway. Sometimes people needed to hear a promise, even if you weren't certain you could keep it. He carefully lifted her head and brought the canteen to her lips. "Slow sips," he instructed. Not too much at once or you'll make yourself sick. She drank greedily, desperately, and he had to pull the canteen away to stop her from taking too much. Her eyes pleaded with him, but he shook his head. I know you want more, but trust me. Small amounts. We'll get you hydrated, but it has to be gradual. James looked around, assessing the situation. There was no shelter here, no shade, nothing but open desert in every direction. The nearest town was Red Creek, still a half-day's ride away. He couldn't leave her here while he went for help, and he couldn't expect her to ride in her condition. He would have to take her with him and hope she survived the journey. He pulled a blanket from his saddlebag and laid it on the ground next to her. As gently as he could, he lifted her onto the blanket. She weighed almost nothing, as if the desert had burned away everything but bone and will. He wrapped her carefully, protecting her burned skin from the sun, then lifted her into his arms and carried her to his horse. The animal shifted nervously, sensing something was wrong, but James spoke to it in a calm, steady voice until it settled. Mounting a horse while carrying a half-dead woman was no easy task, but James had done harder things in his life. He managed to get himself and Sarah into the saddle, holding her across his lap like a child. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against his chest. Every so often, she would murmur something incoherent, fragments of words that made no sense. James didn't press her for answers. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her to safety. The ride to Red Creek was long and tense. James pushed his horse as hard as he dared, but he couldn't risk going too fast and jostling Sarah too much. He stopped every hour to give her more water, just a few sips at a time. He watched her carefully for signs that she was slipping away. But somehow, impossibly, she held on. This woman had been through hell, and she was still fighting. As the sun began to set, the buildings of Red Creek appeared on the horizon. It wasn't much of a town, just a collection of wooden structures clustered around a main street, but it had a doctor, and that was all James cared about. He rode straight to the doctor's office, a small building near the center of town with a sign that read Dr. Plea, Evelyn Morris, physician and surgeon. James dismounted carefully, still cradling Sarah in his arms, and kicked at the door with his boot. Doc, I need help out here. The door opened almost immediately and a woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes looked out. Dr. Morris had seen her share of injuries and illnesses, but even she looked shocked when she saw Sarah. Bring her in, quickly. James carried Sarah inside and laid her on the examination table. Morris immediately went to work, cutting away Sarah's torn clothing to assess the damage. James stood back, giving the doctor room to work, but he couldn't look away. He had found this woman in the desert, and now he felt responsible for her. What happened to her? Morris asked as she examined Sarah's burns and dehydration. I don't know, James admitted. I found her in the Deadlands about 15 miles west of here. She was crawling. I don't know how long she'd been out there, or how she ended up in that condition. Doctor. Morris frowned as she worked, applying salves to Sarah's burns and checking her vital signs. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished. These burns are serious, and she's got some cuts and abrasions that are already infected. But the fact that she's still alive after what she's been through, that's remarkable. This woman has an incredible will to live. Is she going to make it? James asked. I don't know yet, Dr. Morris said honestly. The next 24 hours will tell. If she can fight off the infections and regain some strength, she's got a chance, but it's going to be close. James nodded. Do whatever you can for her. Money's no issue. Dr. Morris glanced at him with a raised eyebrow. You don't even know this woman, do you? No, James said, but that doesn't mean I can just walk away. Over the next few days, James stayed in Red Creek, checking in on Sarah's progress. Dr. Morris worked tirelessly to keep her alive, treating her burns, fighting the infections, and slowly rehydrating her body. Sarah drifted in and out of fever dreams, sometimes calling out names, sometimes crying, sometimes just lying still and silent. James would sit by her bedside when Dr. Dog. Morris allowed it, watching over her like a guardian. On the third day, Sarah's fever broke. She opened her eyes fully for the first time since James had found her and looked around the room with confusion. When her gaze landed on James, sitting in a chair beside her bed, she tried to speak, but her voice was still weak and raspy. Easy, James said, leaning forward. Don't try to talk just yet. You've been through a lot. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know this man, but she knew he had saved her life. She tried to say thank you, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just looked at him with an expression that said everything. "You're safe now," James told her. "You're in Red Creek, and Doc Morris has been taking good care of you. You've been here 3 days." Sarah's brow furrowed as she tried to process that information. 3 days. She had survived 3 days in the desert before James found her, and now she had been unconscious for 3 more. 6 days since the Marshal had left her to die. "Do you remember what happened to you?" James asked gently. "How you ended up out there?" Sarah's expression darkened. The memories came flooding back. The Marshal's betrayal, the long ride into the Deadlands, the moment he told her she was going to die. The pain, the heat, the crawling, all of it. She managed to whisper one word. "Betrayed." James's jaw tightened. "Someone did this to you on purpose." Sarah nodded weakly. "Who?" She struggled to get the words out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Marshal. Fake Marshal. Garrett." James's expression turned grim. "A man claiming to be a marshal left you out there to die?" Another nod. "Do you know why?" She didn't know the details, only that someone in Copper Ridge had paid him to make her disappear. She didn't know who or why. Maybe she had witnessed something she shouldn't have, or maybe she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that she had survived. "Don't worry about it right now," James said. "You need to focus on getting better. We can figure out the rest later." But Sarah's eyes held a fierce determination that surprised him. She might be broken and battered, but she wasn't defeated. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had paid the Marshal to kill her, they were going to regret it. She was alive, and that meant they had failed. And when she was strong enough, she was going to make sure they knew it. Over the following week, Sarah's condition improved steadily. Dr. Morris was amazed at her recovery. Most people wouldn't have survived what Sarah had endured, and those who did usually took months to recover. But Sarah was pushing herself, forcing her body to heal faster than seemed possible. She ate every meal the doctor brought her, even when she had no appetite. She drank water constantly, rebuilding her strength. She let Dr. Morris treat her burns and infections without complaint, enduring the pain in silence. James visited every day, bringing her books to read and telling her stories about his travels. He didn't ask her about the Marshal or the betrayal again. He could see that she wasn't ready to talk about it, and he respected that. Instead, he just kept her company, giving her something to focus on besides the memories that haunted her. As Sarah grew stronger, she began to ask James questions. She wanted to know about him, about his life on the trails, about the places he had been. James was a private man, not given to sharing much about himself, but something about Sarah made him open up. Maybe it was the fact that she had fought so hard to live, or maybe it was the quiet strength he saw in her eyes. Whatever it was, he found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone in years. He told her about his childhood on a ranch in Montana, about losing his family to a fever outbreak when he was 16, about the years he spent drifting from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. He told her about the trails he rode, the people he met, the dangers he faced, and slowly, as he talked, Sarah began to understand that James was just as lost as she was. He had been running from his past just as much as she had been running from hers. By the end of the second week, Sarah was well enough to leave the doctor's office. She could walk again, though her legs were still weak, and her burns had healed enough that they no longer caused her constant pain. Dr. Morris pronounced her recovery nothing short of miraculous and warned her to take it easy for a while longer. Sarah thanked the doctor for everything she had done, knowing that without her skill and care she wouldn't have survived. James was waiting outside when Sarah emerged from the doctor's office. He had rented a room for her at the town's only boarding house and arranged for her to stay there as long as she needed. When Sarah tried to thank him, he just shrugged it off. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, more certain. "You did what most people wouldn't have done. You saved my life, and I won't forget that." James looked at her for a long moment, then nodded.
"What are you going to do now?"
Sarah had been thinking about that question for days. She could go back to Copper Ridge and try to find out who had wanted her dead. She could track down the fake Marshal and make him pay for what he had done. Or she could walk away from all of it and start over somewhere new, somewhere no one knew her name. But as she stood there in the dusty street of Red Creek, looking at James Mackenzie, she realized something. She wasn't the same person who had ridden out of Copper Ridge with the Marshal. That woman had been naive, trusting, and desperate for someone to save her. The woman standing here now had saved herself. She had crawled through hell and come out the other side. And she wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm going to find him," Sarah said quietly. "The Marshal. And I'm going to make sure he never does this to anyone else." James studied her face, seeing the determination there, the fire that hadn't been extinguished despite everything. "That's dangerous. He's a killer, Sarah. He left you for dead once. He won't hesitate to do it again." "I know," Sarah said, "but I can't just walk away, not after what he did." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised both of them.
"Then I'll come with you."
Sarah stared at James, not quite believing what she had heard.
"You would do that?"
"Why?" James took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was thinking hard about something. "Because what happened to you was wrong. Because men like that Marshal shouldn't be allowed to walk free. And because," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "because I've spent 15 years running from things instead of facing them. Maybe it's time I stopped running." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since the Marshal had abandoned her in the Deadlands, she didn't feel completely alone. She had spent her whole life learning not to depend on anyone, not to trust anyone. But James had proven himself different. He had saved her life expecting nothing in return. And now he was offering to help her find justice. She nodded slowly. "All right, we'll do this together." They spent the next few days preparing for the journey. James sold some of his supplies to buy Sarah proper traveling clothes, boots that would hold up on the trail, and a used rifle that the general store owner was willing to part with for a reasonable price. Sarah practiced with the rifle behind the boarding house, getting used to the weight of it, the recoil, the sound. She had fired guns before, living in mining country, but she had never been particularly skilled. James taught her the basics, showing her how to aim, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. "You're not trying to be a sharpshooter," James told her. "You just need to be able to defend yourself if things go wrong." He never made her feel foolish for not knowing something, never talked down to her the way men often did. He treated her like an equal, like someone capable of holding her own. It was a new experience for Sarah, and she found she liked it. While they prepared, James made inquiries around Red Creek about anyone matching the description of Marshal Garrett. He spoke to the local sheriff, to traders who passed through regularly, to anyone who might have seen a man with a stolen badge. The information he gathered painted a disturbing picture. The fake Marshal had been operating for at least 2 years, moving from town to town, using his badge to gain trust, and then disappearing with money, valuables, or in Sarah's case, carrying out paid killings. He had left a trail of victims behind him, and no one had been able to catch him because he never stayed in one place long enough. But James did learn one useful piece of information. A trader had seen a man matching Garrett's description heading east toward the town of Bitter Creek about a week ago. Bitter Creek was a rough place, a haven for criminals and outlaws who wanted to avoid the law. If Garrett was heading there, it made sense. He would blend in, and no one would ask questions about a stolen badge. Sarah and James set out for Bitter Creek on a cool morning in early autumn. The air had a crispness to it that reminded Sarah that summer was ending and winter would come soon. They rode together on James's horse at first, but after 2 days, James bought a second horse from a ranch they passed. He said it was more practical to have 2 horses, but Sarah suspected he did it because he wanted her to feel independent, capable of riding on her own. The journey to Bitter Creek took 5 days. They traveled carefully, avoiding the main roads where they might be seen, camping at night under the stars. James taught Sarah how to build a proper fire, how to track game, how to read the land for signs of water and danger. She soaked up the knowledge like a sponge, understanding that these skills might save her life someday. During those nights around the campfire, Sarah and James talked more than they ever had before. Sarah told him about her childhood in Copper Ridge, about her father who drank himself to death when she was 12, about her mother who ran off with a gambler and never came back. She told him about the years she spent working at the general store, saving money, dreaming of escape. And she told him about the moment she saw the Marshal and thought her dreams were finally coming true, only to have them shattered in the worst way possible. James listened without judgment, without pity. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Then he said, "My family died when I was 16. Thieves swept through our ranch, took my parents and both my sisters in less than a week. I was the only one who survived, and I never understood why. For years I felt guilty about it, like I should have died with them. So I left. I sold the ranch and started riding, telling myself I was looking for something. But really I was just running away from the guilt." "Do you still feel guilty?" Sarah asked softly. "Sometimes," James admitted, "but not as much as I used to. I think I've finally accepted that surviving doesn't make you responsible for the people who didn't. Sometimes life is just cruel and random, and there's no reason for it." She had spent years wondering why her life had been so hard, why she had been dealt such a bad hand. But the desert had taught her something. It had taught her that wondering why was pointless. What mattered was what you did with the hand you were dealt. She had chosen to keep crawling, to keep fighting, and that choice had saved her life. When they finally reached Bitter Creek, it was everything James had warned her it would be. The town was dirty and lawless, with saloons on every corner and gunfights breaking out so regularly that people barely paid attention. The sheriff, if there even was one, was either corrupt or powerless. This was a place where criminals came to hide, and where asking too many questions could get you killed. James and Sarah found a cheap hotel on the edge of town and checked in under false names. James went out to gather information, telling Sarah to stay in the room and keep the rifle close. She wanted to argue, to insist she could help, but she knew he was right. She was still recovering, still building her strength back, and walking into a place like this unprepared could be fatal. James returned several hours later with news. He had found someone who knew Garrett, a bartender who said the fake Marshal had been in town 3 days ago, spending money and drinking heavily. He was bragging about a job he had completed, about how easy it was to fool people with a badge. The bartender didn't know where Garrett was staying, but he said the man came into the saloon every night around sunset. "So we wait for him," Sarah said. "We wait for him," James agreed. "But Sarah, when we find him, you need to let me handle it. This man is dangerous, and he's not going to come quietly." Sarah shook her head. "I need to face him. I need him to see that I survived, that he failed." James looked like he wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew it would be pointless. "All right, but we do this smart. We don't go in guns blazing. We wait for the right moment, and we make sure we have the advantage." They spent the next 2 days watching the saloon. Sarah stayed out of sight, hidden in the shadows across the street, while James went inside to keep an eye on things. On the third night, Garrett finally appeared. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw him walk through the saloon doors. He looked exactly the same. Tall, confident, wearing the stolen badge on his chest like he had every right to it. He ordered a drink and sat at a table in the back, laughing and talking with some rough-looking men. Sarah's hands shook as she watched him. All the fear, all the anger, all the pain she had buried came rushing back. This was the man who had left her to die. This was the man who had taken her trust and twisted it into a weapon. She wanted to march into that saloon and put a bullet in him, but she forced herself to stay still, to wait. James came out of the saloon a few minutes later and found Sarah in the shadows. "He's drinking, and he'll probably be there for hours. We wait until he leaves, follow him, and confront him somewhere private." Sarah nodded, her jaw set. "I'm ready." They waited. Hours passed. The saloon stayed loud and rowdy, and Garrett showed no signs of leaving. But finally, well past midnight, he stood up from his table, said his goodbyes, and walked out into the dark street. He was drunk, stumbling slightly, and he didn't notice Sarah and James following him from a distance. Garrett made his way to a run-down boarding house on the outskirts of town. He fumbled with his key, opened the door, and went inside. James and Sarah waited a few minutes, then approached the building. James tried the door and found it unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, and they slipped inside. The boarding house was dark and silent. They could hear Garrett moving around upstairs, heavy footsteps on creaky floorboards. James led the way up the stairs, his gun drawn, and Sarah followed close behind, her rifle in her hands. They reached the second floor and saw a light coming from under one of the doors. James pointed to it, and Sarah nodded. James kicked the door open. and they burst into the room. Garrett was sitting on the bed, pulling off his boots. He looked up in shock, and for a moment he didn't recognize Sarah. But then his eyes widened, and his face went pale. "You," he whispered, "you're dead. I left you in the Deadlands. You're supposed to be dead." Sarah stepped forward, her rifle pointed at his chest. Her voice was steady, cold. "I didn't die. I crawled out of that desert, and I survived. And now I'm here to make sure you answer for what you did." Garrett's shock quickly turned to anger. "You stupid girl. You should have stayed dead. Do you have any idea what you've done by coming here? The people who paid me to kill you won't stop. They'll send someone else. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Who?" Sarah demanded. "Who paid you?" Garrett laughed bitterly. "You think I'm going to tell you that? You think I'm going to betray the people who give me work? I'd be dead within a week." "You're already dead," James said quietly, his gun still aimed at Garrett. "The only question is whether you die quickly or slowly." Garrett's eyes darted between them, calculating his options. Then, in a sudden movement, he lunged for the gun on his nightstand. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the small room, and Garrett fell back onto the bed, clutching his shoulder. He screamed in pain and rage. "You shot me! You actually shot me!" Sarah lowered the rifle slightly, her hand shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "I could have killed you, but I want you to live long enough to face justice. Real justice, not whatever twisted version you've been pretending to serve." James moved quickly, grabbing rope from his pack and tying Garrett's hands and feet. The fake Marshal cursed and struggled, but he was too drunk and too injured to put up much of a fight. Once he was secured, James stuffed a gag in his mouth to stop the shouting. "We'll take him to the real authorities," James said. "There's a territorial marshal 2 towns over. He'll know what to do with him." Sarah nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. It was done. She had faced the man who tried to kill her, and she had won. She was still alive, still standing, and he was the one who was bound and helpless. The desert hadn't killed her. The betrayal hadn't broken her. She had survived, and that survival was her victory. They took Garrett out of the boarding house in the dark hours before dawn, loading him onto a horse and riding out of Bitter Creek before anyone noticed. The journey to find the territorial marshal took 3 days, and during that time Garrett tried everything to escape, to bargain, to threaten, but Sarah and James ignored him. He was just a man now, stripped of his fake authority, exposed for the coward and killer he truly was. When they finally reached the marshal's office, they handed Garrett over along with a detailed account of his crimes. The marshal, a grizzled man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, listened to their story and promised that Garrett would face trial for his actions. He also promised to investigate the people in Copper Ridge who had hired Garrett, to find out who wanted Sarah dead and why. As they left the marshal's office, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. The weight she had been carrying, the need for justice, had finally been lifted. Garrett would face the consequences of his actions, and Sarah could move forward with her life. James walked beside her, quiet and thoughtful. Finally, he said, "What will you do now?" Sarah had been thinking about that question for days. She could go back to Copper Ridge and reclaim her old life, but she didn't want that anymore. That life belonged to a different person, someone who didn't exist anymore. She had changed. The desert had changed her. The betrayal had changed her. She was stronger now, harder, but also more certain of who she was and what she wanted. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I know I'm not going back to Copper Ridge. That part of my life is over." James nodded slowly. "I've been thinking too, about what I said back in Red Creek, about being tired of running. I think I meant it. I think I'm ready to stop moving and find somewhere to settle down." Sarah looked at him, seeing the hope in his eyes, the quiet longing for something more than a life on the trails. "Where would you go?"
"I don't know," James said with a small smile.
"But I was thinking maybe you could help me figure that out. We make a good team, Sarah. We've proven that. And maybe we could build something together. Something that doesn't involve running or hiding or fighting. Just living." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of possibility, of hope, of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. She had survived the Deadlands. She had faced her betrayer and won. And now, standing here with James Mackenzie, She realized that her story wasn't about what had been done to her. It was about what she had done for herself. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." And so they rode away from the Marshal's office together, two people who had been broken by their pasts, but who had found strength in each other. They didn't know where they were going or what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them was afraid. They had survived the worst life could throw at them, and they had come out the other side. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The desert had tried to claim Sarah Colton, but she had refused to die. She had crawled through hell and emerged on the other side, stronger and more determined than ever. And now, with James by her side, she was ready to build a life worth living. Not the life someone else had promised her, but a life she had earned through blood, sweat, and sheer stubborn will. The Deadlands didn't give second chances, but Sarah Colton had taken hers anyway.